Hi guys, so I wanted to show you this video between a journalist from Sky News and Ian Blackford, who's an MP for the SNP in Westminster. So he's going to respond to comments regarding the differences in the approach to ending the lockdown between Scotland and England. And he'll respond to some comments about how Boris Johnson has dealt with this situation.
He's so determined to do this a different way.
Well, it's not about the SNP being determined to do things a different way, Mark. It's the government in Edinburgh and a view which is shared by the government in Cardiff and Belfast as well. We face a situation where our R rate is not as low as we would like to see. We are closer to the 1 than we are to the 0.5. And of course, based on the evidence that our First Minister takes from the scientific community in Scotland, we believe that what we have to do for now is continue the work that we're doing to make sure that people do stay at home unless it's necessary to leave for shopping, for medicines, for essential work, for daily exercise, that we support the NHS and we do all we can to keep the death rate as is possible. And that's a view that's not just taken by the Scottish Government, but it's been taken by the government in Cardiff and Belfast as well. And but if I must say, one of the things which
let me just interrupt you there. I mean, but you say your R rate is not that different from the R rate in England, but what you're saying is that you don't trust the scientific advice that is being given to the Westminster government.
Actually, he's not saying that, but I'll allow him to defend himself. But the difference is that you believe that he doesn't believe the scientific advice coming to the given to the government in Westminster, but that's not the case. There's a difference between what evidence and scientific advice is given to Boris Johnson and what Boris Johnson tells the public. There's always going to be a battle between the scientists and the politicians. So any critique of Boris Johnson's approach is not automatically a critique of the scientists' advice to Boris Johnson, because the scientists give him advice and then he either acts completely on that advice, he ignores that advice, he cherry picks that advice. Some things he likes, some things he doesn't like. But he's the one who acts on the advice. No one's criticizing the scientists in the UK, in Westminster, who are giving advice to Boris Johnson. There's a very big difference here between the scientific advice given to Boris Johnson and what Boris Johnson acts upon. And I thought a journalist would be able to identify those two differences.
Is that what you're saying?
No, absolutely, demonstrably not. And I respect the right of Boris Johnson to do what he thinks is right based on the scientific evidence that's put in front of him. But it is the case that the R rate, based on our best analysis, is slightly higher in Scotland than it is in other parts of the United Kingdom. And it's right that we continue to drive down the rate of infection, drive down the death rate, and that's what...
And that makes perfect sense as well. If the rate is too high and you feel uncomfortable with opening up the country by ending the lockdown in the way that Boris Johnson wants to do it, then you're within your rights to say, look, we're not comfortable with a high or borderline reproductive rate on 1. It's too close to 1. We want to wait. We want to suppress it until it's in a situation where it's at a level that results in a situation that we can handle.
What we are seeking to do, it would have been much better if we could have had a 4-nation compromise on all of this, but Boris Johnson has chosen for his own reasons to go ahead with what he's announced last night and came to Parliament for today, and I respect his right to do that. But equally, the First Ministers and all the other administrations have got responsibility for interpreting the scientific advice that we get, and of course the First Minister has her own resilience committee. So
you have to remember there's this constant battle between the politicians and the scientists. The scientists would prefer to lock down completely. Now the politicians would not accept that, so there's going to be a compromise. The scientists would say we need to test as many people as possible, including members of the public. The politicians decide not to follow that, in many cases maybe because they don't want to invest the resources necessary to do that. They have their own problems to deal with. So what the scientists recommend to do and what the politicians tell the public that they're doing are completely different things on many occasions. Sometimes they correlate, in other times they don't.
The position that we have taken is that we must continue to drive this down. And I will say to people that if I look at my own island of Skye, we've had a significant outbreak over the course of the last few days. We must continue the pressure to drive this down until it's safe to do anything else. Of course, we want people to be able to go back to work. Of course, we want to ease the lockdown restrictions, but only when it's safe to do so.
But there will be many people. There'll be many people in Scotland as well as the rest of the UK who will be wanting and needing to get back to work, and the casualties of a prolonged lockdown could be very serious indeed.
Well, the casualties of doing the wrong thing will be an increase in the death rate, and that's what we must guard against. And there is a YouGov poll out today that shows overwhelming support for keeping the measures that we have in place in Scotland and indeed in the other devolved nations as well. We're doing the right thing by the people here. Of course, we want people to go back to work, but when it's safe to do so. Of course, we want people to be able to travel to the tourist areas when it's safe to do so. But
and this makes sense. You say we want to reduce the reproductive rate to a level that we are comfortable with. Our scientists are probably telling us we need to reduce the reproductive rate to 0 if possible, or 0.1, or at least at the most 0.5. Because the reproductive rate, once it arrives at 0.5, there's a risk that it will go back up again if you open too quickly, if you open too much. And then you have to fight to get it down again. If you are hovering around 1 and then you open up your society, there's a risk that it could go up to 2, go up to 3. And you don't want that. And then you have to be more draconian. So I think the Scottish government's approach makes sense here, to be more cautious. Because we haven't been cautious enough, we should be much more cautious with this virus.
But my message today is we've got to keep the pressure up. And my message is for people in England, don't think about coming to travel to Scotland, because we've got to keep the measures in place to protect everybody. I hope the Prime Minister's right. But if he's not, then he's of course going to have to reverse some of the decisions that he's taking, because the key priority for all of us, and I know that the Prime Minister and the First Ministers all share this, is we've got to keep the R rate down.
Yeah.
But for us in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's not right to be taking off the restrictions which are in place yet. Of course, we all understand the impact on the economy. Of course, we want to make sure that we can rebound from this. But actually, if we unlocked early and we then saw a spike in the infection rate, we'll actually do greater long-term damage to the economy than we would with the measures.
But the scientists advising Boris Johnson, they know that well and good, but they're saying this is the way to do it.
No, they're not saying it. Boris Johnson is saying it. There's a difference. I've said this before. The scientists are saying one thing, and Boris Johnson is saying another in some cases. They're giving him advice, and then he's giving the public the advice that he has edited in a way. What the public are hearing are not the same thing as what the scientists are saying.
Gradual easing. You see, there will be those who will say that this is a nationalist government in Scotland and they're seeing the whole crisis through the lens of independence.
I think you're seeing this through the wrong end of the lens, if I may say so, because what we're doing, and keep in mind this is done by the other devolved administrations as well, is making sure that we're protecting our citizens from an increase in the R rate, from an increase in the death rate. This has got nothing to do with constitutional politics. And the one thing I would say to you is that I would much prefer that we had a four-nation solution to this, but we simply could not take the risks of taking off the lockdown measures, given where our R rate is today. What we've done is what is responsible. What the First Minister's done is responsible and has the backing of the...
This is quite a disgusting remark, that this is a nationalistic approach to this coronavirus, and that in a way this is the implied meaning here, that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP are trying to go it alone because they disagree with Boris Johnson politically, and this is not about saving lives, but this is about political point scoring. And I think this is quite disgusting, because if it had been the other way around, and Boris Johnson was saying, look, we need to take it easy, we need to go more slowly, and the Scottish government were saying, no, we need to open up, we're different, we want to open our economies, we're not like you, we're better, or whatever, then I could sort of understand that. But the Scottish government are willing to take the economic damage to save their citizens' lives, while Boris Johnson is willing to take political risks with people's lives in order to save the economy. Who here cares more about their citizens? The SNP or the Tories?
People in Scotland, we've had terrible mixed messages coming out from Westminster over the course of the last few days. We still haven't got the guidance for those that are going back to work. We have to be cautious. We have to respect that until there are vaccination available against this, until there are ways of treating this, we're at enormous risk from this virus and its potential to spread.
I mean, do you accept, just finally, do you accept that the moves being made by the government in London may be the right thing for England?
As I said, I respect the right for Boris Johnson to interpret the scientific advice that he has been given. I hope he's right. I hope that the measures that he's putting in place will not see an increase in the infection rate. If it is not that the case, if there is an increase in the infection rate, then they'll have to respond to this. But we want to keep people safe wherever they are through the United Kingdom.
Boris Johnson is doing what Boris Johnson believes is best for Boris Johnson. How many more examples do we have to see of that? Everything that Boris Johnson does is in the interest of Boris Johnson. One of the reasons why he won't apologize for the mistakes made during this crisis is because he's afraid that when there is a public inquiry, evidence of him apologizing for the mistakes will be used against him. So he's not apologizing. He hasn't said, we have made mistakes, I apologize, the NHS should have had the PPE they needed, but they didn't have it. He has never apologized, and his party members and his cabinet will not apologize, because they know as soon as they apologize, then they can be dragged in front of an inquiry, and this will be used against them. They will have admitted to have made these mistakes. Now, at the same time, Boris Johnson is moving ahead with releasing the lockdown, and the Scottish government are saying, no, we need to go more slowly. The government in Northern Ireland are saying we need to go more slowly. The government in Wales are saying we need to go more slowly. So which power, which country cares more about their citizens? Once again, I don't think Boris Johnson is putting the lives of ordinary people foremost. I think he's putting his own political career at the top of the agenda. He's putting the party before everything else. He's putting his government before everyone else. And unfortunately, mistakes are going to be made going ahead, but Boris Johnson will not take responsibility for them, because, as I said before, when there's a public inquiry, he could be held responsible for many of these actions. I believe he is responsible for them, but if he admits that he was responsible for these mistakes, then there will be a political, or perhaps worse, price to pay. Let me know in the comments, guys. As always, your comments are much appreciated. Thanks. Why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server, where we share news, chat, and have some fun? If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.